Well, it's that time again. Time to crack open two older kits that have been sitting in the stash for far too long. And in case anyone's wondering exactly how long they've been waiting, this invoice here should give you a pretty good idea. Yep, I think they've waited long enough. Let's go ahead and get these built. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a double feature model showcase video for this 135th scale Australian Army M113A1 FSV. Both of the models in this video are built for my own personal collection and are not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 135th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. Both models that you see here are built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and made some modifications to them throughout the building process. We'll be going over these additions and modifications in this video, along with reviewing the base starter kit that these models came from. So stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of info and content coming at you. Start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around these two models. And these two vehicles here are the Australian Army M113A1 FSV Salamans. The FSV is an abbreviation for the Fire Support Vehicle. And this vehicle here does have a fairly interesting background, and it dates back to the early to mid 1960s. Prior to the mid-1960s, the Australian Army were equipped with mainly British-produced armored cars. The armored cars, however, during the 1960s era were starting to become dated, and the Australians were looking to replace them with a vehicle that was fully tracked. It is at this time here that they evaluated two potential offerings, one from the United Kingdom and the other was the M113 from the United States. At the end of the trials, the M113 came above the British-produced alternative, so the Australians decided to adopt that vehicle for their standard armored personnel role. But the Australians also needed a vehicle to act for fire support, as well as light airborne type mobility. It was at this point where the Australians took a look at the American-produced Sheridan. At this time, the Sheridan was in production and being adopted by the US military. This would have been a perfect vehicle for the Australians to use for this role, and they did evaluate and test a sample of one of these vehicles. Unfortunately, the Australians weren't going to be able to adopt the Sheridan because at this time the Sheridan was not in production for foreign sales and was primarily being produced for the US military. It was going to be a number of years before the Sheridan was going to be available for purchase for an allied country like Australia. So as a stopgap measure, the Australians decided to make their own interim vehicle utilizing the hull of the M113 and combining it with the turret from the Saladin armored car. Around the 1968 timeframe, a prototype vehicle was cobbled together and went through its trials, and it actually performed quite well. The vehicle was later adopted by the Australian military as the M113A1 FSV. In the early 1970s, the vehicles were deployed to South Vietnam, however, were only there for a limited period of time. After about a year or so of in-field use, it was decided that the Australians were going to pull out of the Vietnam conflict, and they took their FSVs with them. Outside of the Vietnam War, the FSV stayed in Australian Armour Service all the way up until the mid-1980s, upon which time they were declared obsolete and were basically just sold off as surplus. The vehicles were separated from their hulls, and a large number of the ex-FSV hulls were sold to New Zealand, who repurposed them and used them as other armored personnel carrier roles. The concept of the M113 shoehorned into being a light tank was a concept that apparently the Australians liked very much because once the Saladin turreted variants of the FSV were phased out, they immediately replaced them with a newer generation variant that still used the M113 hull but utilized the turret from another British vehicle. This variant saw service all the way up until the mid-1990s. Automotive-wise, the vehicle is your standard American-made M113A1. Now, it's important to point out that when the Australians first evaluated the vehicle, they just evaluated the standard M113, but when they got shipments and deliveries from the United States, they were upgraded to the A1. The difference, of course, is the engine. The original M113 utilized a gas-powered engine, while the A1 variant was upgraded with a diesel engine. For ballistic protection, the vehicles are made from aluminum alloy plating. The aluminum alloy makes the vehicles very light, but also gives them sufficient protection from small arms fire. Of course, the vehicle's turret came from the British Saladin armored car. The Saladin was a 6-wheel armored car that was developed by the United Kingdom in the mid-1950s. The vehicles themselves utilize a 75mm gun in a revolving turret, and the vehicles stayed in British service and actually in production throughout the 1960s and ended really in the early 1970s. What's interesting is, although the Australians recently adopted the Saladin armored car, they quickly decided to change and upgrade to something else. More than likely, this was due to mobility. The wheeled drive of the Saladin was just not as good for driving on off-road conditions compared to a fully tracked vehicle, which is what the Australians were really looking for, and of course at the end is why they settled for the M113. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplied you with. And here are the models at the start of the build. Now, for the base starter kit, I will be utilizing two identical Tamiya M113 Australian Fire Support Vehicle kits. Now, just like what I mentioned in the pre-video bumper, these kits here have been sitting in the stash for a really long period of time, so it's going to feel really good with cracking them open and getting them built. Now, these models themselves were purchased from Squadron mail order, and these kits here are relatively easy to find, being Tamiya kits, and I believe these kits might even still be in production. So they are quite prolific and, again, are fairly easy to come by with a simple Google search. Or, more likely, you can possibly snag one of these kits in your local hobby shop. Now, since both of these models are literally the exact same kit, let me go ahead and bring the camera in closer so I can start doing the review of the model in more depth. But before I do, let me go ahead and wipe off the 14 plus years of dust that have been sitting on the kit surface. Alright, that's one of them, and oddly enough, this was the one that was on the bottom of the pile. This one here was on the top. Let's see exactly how much crud we got off this guy. Yeah. Alright, so with that out of the way, let me go ahead and go into the background history of this particular kit. Okay, now the M113A1 FSV kit from Tamiya has its roots back in 1975. At that point there, Tamiya released the standard M113 Armored Personnel Carrier kit, and that kit was the basis of all the other M113 renditions that Tamiya would release in later years. This particular kit here, the FSV version, was released by Tamiya in 1979. Now, with the way Tamiya designed their M113 kit, they have a standardized hull with standardized suspension, and the part that differentiates the different kits from each other is with the design of the top deck. With the way Tamiya designed the kit, you can have different top decks that are developed, and this then transforms the base vehicle into any other rendition that Tamiya had an idea on creating. And that's exactly what they did here with this variant. Now, in the late 1970s, this was the period where Tamiya was moving away from their motorized kits and were primarily just releasing their models in a static format. And this kit here, again, falls right into that time frame. As far as I know, there have been no motorized, out-of-the-box renditions of this vehicle made by Tamiya. Now, starting with the model's graphic design, it is, well, pretty much standard Tamiya. We have a white background type layout, and here we have the vehicle subject matter right here dead center. Just like with the other Tamiya box arts, the vehicle itself is very nicely rendered, and it does encapsulate all of the fine detailing which would be found on the real FSV M113. Here we have the typography. Note they went ahead and mounted it vertical on the side here. And it utilizes the typical fonts and typefaces which are generally found on these Tamiya kits. Moving to the side, here we have a quick little thumbnail of the kit as well as some verbiage written in Japanese. And on the opposite side here we have several of the other kits that they have offered in their catalog, and this is standard on Tamiya kits. Or I should say on more of the older generation Tamiya kits. I'm not sure if the newer ones tend to do this type of advertising. Here we have several of the other M113s in their lineup, which is the standard American APC variant. Now this version here does have the interior, which is not present on this particular kit, which you'll see that once I crack the box open. We have here the command version. They also have a martyr. I guess they're keeping up with the theme of modern infantry or armored personnel carriers. And on the tail end, oddly enough, a Gepard. Well, enough with that. Let's go ahead and crack this model open. Now, like I stated before, these kits here are exterior models exclusive. There are no interior detailings found on these kits. Here we have the hull. Now, this is the standardized M113 Hull, which is found on all the Tamiya kits. What's interesting to point out is that this kit was originally designed to be motorized. Keep in mind, this kit was designed in the mid-1970s, and at that time, Tamiya was primarily releasing their models in a motorized format. Although, interesting enough, I've never seen one of these kits in the motorized form, nor have I ever seen one with a dual motor gearbox with a fancy box art, but that's probably a story for another day. Here we have the suspension integrally molded into the lower hull. Now, this would be considered pretty basic compared to the type of tooling that we see on more modern renditions of this type of vehicle today. I believe AFV Club recently released one of these kits, and from what I understand, that kit is much more advanced with the type of details that you see here on the suspension, where rather than molding it in, it's probably separate pieces, and it probably leaves for a better quality model compared to this older kit. Having said that though, these old Tamiya kits, again, they just build very well, which is why Tamiya still themselves produces these kits here by and large. The back plate is integrally molded in. Note it does have a lot of nice detailing found on it. Digging down further, this is now the runner, which makes this the FSV version of the vehicle. Let me just go ahead and pop open this bag here. All the parts are made out of this green injection molded plastic, and it's that dark green color, which is, again, quite typical for Tamiya kits. Here you can see the detailing found on the molded in sections, which is, again, pretty standard for these kits. In the bottom of the bag, we have here a set of water slide decals, which is, again, quite customary for these Tamiya kits. The quality on them look to be pretty standard, which, needless to say, is something that, again, is a typical occurrence on these Tamiya kits. Moving in further in the box takes us to the second parts bag. And here we have the M113 Hull specific parts, which gives you the side skirts, front armor plate, engine hatch. Note the detailing found on the louvers, bow hatch, lights. Basically, the hull fittings are all comprised by and large on this runner here. On the rear hatch, we have some interior detailing. Keep in mind, on the armored personnel variant of this kit, it was offered with full interior detailing, which makes sense to have this piece here molded with these type of features. Same could also be said with the engine hatch as well. Digging down deeper takes us to the road wheels and the running gear. Here we have the sprockets. Main road wheels. Note the fastener detailing found on these parts. Nicely rendered, again, specifically for the age of the tooling. This is 1975 tooling. You must, be keep that in mind. And the tooling did age pretty well, which is why Tamiya still releases renditions of the M113, just with some polished up runners here and there. Here goes the M2HB. Now this is not going to be utilized on this kit. They give you another M1919, which is mounted on the vehicle's turret. Now the M2 that is supplied with the M113 kit is a little bit on the dated side, but that's not really a topic for this video, since it's not going to be used on this model. Also in the bag, we have here a set of rubber polycaps, which if anyone has ever built any Tamiya kits, should look pretty standard to you. And on the very bottom, we have here the tracks. Now the tracks that come with this kit are your standard Tamiya single-piece vinyl type tracks. Now they do have their detailing found on the face, which includes the grousers as well as the small rubber pad, which is found in the center of this pattern of track. On the inside of the tracks, there are no other details like the interior link type detailing, which is found on other renditions of this type of vehicle that are found on the 1/35 scale market. However, though, these tracks, again, they're simple and by and large, they do the job. And finally, at the bottom of the box, we have not one but two sets of instructions. This is something that was seen on a lot of Tamiya kits from this era. Basically, it is the exact same set of instructions, just one pamphlet is entirely in English as well as in German, while the other instruction sheet is all in Japanese. Inside, it's again literally the exact same thing. And if anyone has ever opened up these Tamiya instructions, everyone knows that they are basically the gold standard when it comes to assembling a plastic model kit. They're very clear, concise, and they tell you everything that needs to be done. And also, what's really cool is they usually have a little cartoon caricature here of the type of figure that the vehicle would have. And here's the model during its build. Now, the kit itself is basically being built out of the box, and I'll go over more about the other aspects of the model as the video continues. But two things I want to bring up is first, the one modification I made was with this little hole that we have over here, or I should say the lack thereof one. Originally there would have been a square molded into this section here in order for a gearbox to be mounted into this kit. On this model here, since being built as static, the hole is unnecessary, so I went ahead and I plated and deleted it with the bodywork. The plating fulfills the top portion, but also the side portion as well. The plastic itself was just from Plastruct. I believe it's about a ½ inch in width, if I'm not mistaken, and the piece was a perfect fit and just dropped directly into place that you see it here. Now, outside of this little filled-in spot, one portion of this build that I want to point out, because it's one that I made a mistake on this build, and it is one that I made a mistake on when I built my first Tamiya M113 kit about going on over 20 years ago now, and that has to do with the final drive. Now, the final drive consists of two pieces. We have the final drive, and we have this little stem that gets glued to the inside. Well, if you're building the model, you'll think that, oh, well, it's a Tamiya kit, it probably has a polycap on the sprocket, and, you know, you need this little peg here for the sprocket to fit on. Well, that would be the case 90% of the time, but this is the one time it's not. Now, on this model, the way it's designed is that this peg gets glued to the sprocket, and it actually can spin freely. And this is a straight-up mistake by me, because even in the instructions, it mentions that. It's just one of those things I literally just overlooked. Now, because of that, the sprocket is not going to fit onto this stem in a nice, secure manner. Now, here I have one of the sprockets. Now, when I slip it on, you'll see that it does fit on, but it's a little bit on the looser end. It's not really visible at this point here, but once you put the track on, with the track tension put on it, it's going to be really on the floppy side on you. So because of that, I'm going to have to redesign the sprocket mounting setup. Now, the fix is actually a relatively easy one. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the stock molded ones away, drill the section out, and replace it with one long metal shaft. The shaft is 1/8 of an inch thick. It's the exact same diameter of the original plastic unit that we have here. Now, in addition to being the exact same diameter, the rod is also the exact same length to the stock ones, and the measurements are from where it ends on this point to where it ends on that point there. This is crucial because this will ensure that the sprocket alignment is exactly where it needs to be, and you won't have one sprocket sticking out further than the other, which can lead to alignment issues with the track. And here the final drive's now drilled out. This was done on the drill press. Now, a drill press is not a mandatory bit of equipment, but like in most cases, it does make the job a lot easier. The same procedure can be done either with a Dremel or even with a pin vise. Now, I do recommend drilling a pilot hole first. What this entails is that when you snip the stem off with the clipper here, with the way these are molded, a lot of times in the center, there's going to be this little divot that is found on the dead center of the shaft. And this is a great point to drill a pilot hole in, which will help align the main drill bit going through the material. For the pilot hole, I used a 1/16 of an inch drill bit. It went directly through, and then I switched the bit to the 1/8 of an inch, and it finished the job. And with the model fully completed, you get to see how the sprockets look now that the modification and the repair work has been done. With the magic of the M113's rear ramp able to work and function, you can see exactly how the metal rod runs across the lower front portion of the model. Now, if this version here had the full interior detailing, that would be a little bit more problematic, but for this particular variant, it's something that can easily be addressed. And although the sprockets are permanently affixed to each other, and they do have their nice tight track tension to them, you can see that they still pivot. Now, why this is important is not necessarily for, well, pushing it on the rug, which is not something that I do. However, with this modification, it is something that can be done. But the reason why this is important has to do with the rubber tracks. You see, with the way these single-piece vinyl tracks assemble, you are going to have a link or two that the two halves conjoin, and you have that separation point. On rubber tracks, the best way to assemble them is you take that section and you conceal it somewhere on the vehicle span. That's not very noticeable. It's more easily done when you have vehicles with side skirts like this. Why this is important is because when it comes time for fitting on the track, you want to adjust the orientation properly, and perhaps maybe you want to adjust where this conjoining point is, and this is best done when these sprockets are still movable. Aside from that mishap I had with the sprocket, the remainder of the suspension went together without any other issues or problems to mention. The suspension assembles very easily and is one that can go through in a very quick manner. While on the wheels, however, I just want to point out a quick painting technique that I've been utilizing a lot on my more recent builds, and that has to do with the way the center of the road wheels are weathered. You'll notice that on this model here, I replicated the oil seepage look that is typically found on ball bearings when they start aging and getting some wear. As the units are driven, the seals start wearing out, and then you're going to start seeing the seepage of the lubricants found on the torsion bar. And this is found on just about all of these type of military vehicles. This was done to both sides as well as both of the models that I have represented here, because it's a really nice way to give your model just that little extra touch required when you're going through the weathering process. From the wheels now takes to the track. The track on these two models here are the stock units and were mounted without any problems really to mention. When it comes time for painting, however, like I often point out, the M113 track is just like the other contemporary tracks that were used of the period by the West, specifically the US military, where you have a mix of metal and rubber components. Namely, the link itself, of course, was made from a single piece of cast steel, but the face that you see here, which would make contact with the roadway, would have been a rubber pad. Another rubber pad was also found on the inside portion right over here on the inner section of the link. When it comes time for painting these units, of course, you're on the metal sections, you want to have them painted and weathered differently compared to the pieces which would be rubber, which is a good way to give you a nice standout effect on your build. A common mistake I see on many builds out there is that people just paint the entire track black, or they just rust it all up, forgetting that the units are actually rubber. This is, again, an easy way to really make your model shine. You can see here on this model, I went ahead and weathered the metal sections to be a little bit more worn, where you have some surface rust starting to show, but the rubber pads themselves are definitely something that stand out off of the metal surface. This, of course, is seen on the exterior, and if I can get it on video, the interior portion as well. Of course, the tooth itself would be metal and would wear as such. While on the running gear, the last thing to point out is the idler. When it comes time for painting and weathering the idler, you want to keep something in mind. On the M113 family, the main road wheels are rubber rimmed, but the idler is not. When it comes time for painting and weathering the idler, you want to have it in a polished steel or metal type coloring, because keep in mind, as the vehicle is driven, this unit here is going to clean up very quickly, specifically since it's running on a constant rubber surface. And that now brings us up to one of the more iconic details found on the M113 family, and that's the side skirts. See, the side skirts on the M113 consists of 4 components. You have the front and rear end sections, a long channel piece of steel, and then you have the largest portion, which is the center span. What's interesting to point out is that the center span is made from rubber, very thick rubber. The rubber itself is fastened to the front and rear flaps that we have here, and then it is sandwiched to the side of the vehicle via the large channel that we have on this section. When it comes time for painting and weathering, clearly you want to keep this in mind, and you don't want to heavily weather this with any sort of rust type material, of course being rubber. Now, on real vehicles, I've generally seen them in this type of format where the rubber is just left in its natural coloring, but there are also lots of cases out there where the entire side of the hull was overpainted and repainted with some other color. Because of that, you will have the rubber get overpainted, but the paint will start to chip off in a very quick manner, and it's actually one that you can replicate, and as long as you weather it appropriately, can give you some pretty cool results on your build. If you're doing an M113 otherwise, you just want to have the center section be left in black, that's also perfectly suffice, but also it gives you an opportunity to weather it in a nice manner where, like you see it here, it has some contrast compared to the remainder of the vehicle. Same thing, of course, is done on both renditions of my model. It's also important to point out that on many of these FSVs that I've seen take or see service during the Vietnam War, the Australians apparently just removed the side skirts altogether for one reason or another. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you're building one of these vehicles, replicating the ones used during that conflict. Moving to the front portion of the model, literally all of the components that you see here found on this model are stock with the Tamiya kit and were mounted as is with no mods being necessary. That basically leads us to our next most iconic bit of detailing found in this pattern of vehicle, and that's the large rectangle plate that we have here on the front. If anyone was wondering what that is, well, that is a bow plane. You see, the M113 was fully amphibious, and it had this feature where you had this hinged plate that would swing open. This large mechanism that we have here was a prop and would keep it in its open state, and this would push water out of the way, giving the vehicle better mobility in the water. Well, it basically stayed on this pattern of vehicle throughout the remainder of its life, although towards the end you will start seeing these components be pitched to the wayside. But for this model here, of course, it was seen and used and was just simply implemented on this build. One thing I do want to point out is that on the Tamiya model, you have the option of rendering this in two ways. You can have it in the way that I have it here, where it's just mounted in its closed state, but they have an option to have it in its propped up state, where in order to do that, you mount this in the kit supplied holes in a different manner, and you have the other prop here in its propped up state, which would give you the necessary detailing required. The piece itself on the real vehicle, I want to point out, is actually made from plywood. So again, this is going to come to effect when it comes time for anyone weathering one of these vehicles. You want to keep the rusting to a minimum because, again, plywood doesn't rust. In fact, the entire vehicle doesn't really get much rust because all of the panels and the armor plates found on the M113 family are made from ballistic aluminum plate as opposed to steel. So keep that in mind if you're working on one of these models. From the bow plane takes to the next iconic bit of detailing for the M113 family, and that's the two spare track links that are found right here on the lower corner. These are the kit supply components and are nicely detailed out of the box. There's no need to find any replacements or anything. They could just simply be used as is. But when it comes time for mounting them, of course, you want to keep in mind on how they're weathered. Just like with the main track bands that I mentioned before, you can see how I weathered these units where the end sections as well as the tooth have their metal weathering on it, but the center portion is a giant rubber pad, and that can be seen molded onto the Tamiya piece, which makes it easier to paint. And it's one, when you do paint it right, it really does make the model pop a little bit more. While on this section here, I also want to point out one area where a beginner can probably fumble when it comes time for building one of these vehicles is how these plates actually go together. You see on the Tamiya kit here, the entire side hull section is one continuous molding, but the front, the engine hatch, as well as the remainder of the top plate are three separate pieces, and they all need to interlock and fit together in order to get the appropriate fit. The Tamiya kit is nicely engineered in that these pieces do go in their appropriate locations with really no hand fitting being required, but you do have to be careful as the assembler to make sure that the pieces align properly once the glues are still setting, so that once everything sets, they are squared away and exactly where they need to be. If one of the panels are improperly set, this may lead to issues with your build, so you have to keep in mind of that when assembling one of these kits. From the structure takes us to the details. Now, this is also an area to watch out for on these Tamiya M113s. All the kit supply details, of course, were utilized, and they did go in their appropriate locations, but you do have to pay attention on how the pieces do fit. It's not that any hand fitting really needs to be required, but it's one of those things where you have to have a certain sequence in how you install the parts. It's a bit like a Rubik's Cube. If you try to install some parts before the others, you're going to run into issues when it comes time to fitting some of these pieces, like the ones back here, into their appropriate locations. So it is properly labeled in the instructions, but what I saw was that when it comes time for assembly, you want to first mount on the two lift rings, then the siren, which is found right over here, and then you can mount on the brush guards with the headlights. You go through that type of sequence, the build will go by in a smoother rate. The front hatch is also fully functional on these models, where the engine hatch can get fitted, and with the way the model assembles, no glue is required to hold the hatch in place, and it does hinge open. However, because you do have to put that large dive plane in place, the functionality of the piece is really negated, but it is something to keep aware of in case you're working on one of these builds. Moving our way to the rear of the vehicle, just like with the front, this is another area you do want to take your time with, specifically when it comes time for the rear ramp. You see, the rear ramp on the model is fully functional in that it does hinge outward. It locks on pretty well, so well in fact I need to go in from the inside just to punch it out, like so. Here you can see how the unit is hinged. It has two hinges right here on the lower section, and they do function pretty well, specifically when you get the unit assembled. But I want to stress and point out that the hinge tabs themselves are very, very frail, and you can easily break them during the course of assembly as well as fitting. So caution needs to be exhibited by the builder on that. It's not impossible, but it's one of those things that if you're a beginner, you want to take your time with and really go through in a methodical pace. Once it's installed, however, the piece is basically strong and works actually quite well. Now again, just like with the front, obviously there is no interior detailing to point out on this build, but it is nice to have the ramp in a functional manner. Also, it's nice to point out that Tamiya did do a pretty decent job with the interior detailing. You have the ramp, its hatch door present, as well as those really cool half-moon anti-slip rails that are found on those two sections. On the model here, even though it has no interior detailing, of course I painted and weathered this section on the remainder of the rim. When the piece is going to be displayed closed, you just lift it up and it'll simply snap into its location like you see there. The retention is very nicely engineered on this model and it holds it up very well. Aside from the functionality, the remainder of the rear plate detailing is all stock with the Tamiya kit and by and large, go on without any problems. The only thing I want to point out is that these details back here are on the smaller end, and because of that, when it comes time for final assembly, a tweezer is going to be a really good ally in helping you get everything in their appropriate locations in a nice, straight, and square manner. This, of course, would include the lever back here for the secondary hatch, the tow hitch, the tow cable mounts, and yes, even the two taillights, and more importantly, their guards. These pieces are a little bit on the frailer end, but again, assemble fairly well, even with their condition. One other thing I want to point out between the two models, you'll notice that I did paint them differently, and because of which, I went ahead and painted the nylon straps differently between the two vehicles. It's not uncommon to have several patterns and colors of straps found on these vehicles throughout the years of being used. Moving up to the top plate first takes us to the engine hatch area, namely that of the exhaust manifold. The exhaust stack you see here is the stock original unit, and one thing to point out on the Tamiya kits is that they are molded solid. One quick modification to make is with a pin vise you drill out this location here, giving the model a little bit more accuracy. However, like I also frequently mention, if you do not have the skill set or the tools required to do this procedure, you might want to hold off, because if you screw this up, it kind of ruins the piece. So it's one of those things where only do it if you have the proper prerequisites. Well, from the exhaust manifold takes us to the driver's hatch. Now, one unique attribute found on the Australian FSV is with the hatch's design. You see, on the other renditions of the M113, the hatch is just hinged in the back and just opens in that manner. However, on the Australian pattern, they had to change the design slightly because of the turret. Rather than the hatch being hinged, the hatch has to elevate upward and then it rotates out of the way, much along the same way as you would see on a Panther, a King Tiger, or a late production Tiger's commander's cupola. On the Tamiya kit here, the piece is designed to be configured in one of two ways, either open or closed. However, on my model, I actually modified them to have the hatch be fully functional. This was done with the use of a Dremel and a rib nail, where I simply amputated the stem and just replaced it with a metal rod. The metal nail holds everything where it needs to be, but as you can see, allows me to swing the driver's hatch completely out of the way. Same is true for this unit that we have here. Although, again, the vehicle does not have full interior detailing, it's just one of those features I wanted to add to my build just to make it stand out from the pack. Before I get the hatches fully closed, you can see that I did paint and weather the underside of the hatch just for good measure. And with that out of the way, this now brings us to the remainder of the top deck detailing, which is left, you guessed it, completely stock. Literally nothing else was needed to have been made to these sections over here in order to complete the model. The lift rings, again, are kit supplied. Like I said before with the front, they are a little bit, not necessarily on the delicate end, but one of those pieces you just want to take some care with when it comes time for sprue removal and fitting. It's one of those pieces that you could lose pretty easily, and if that thing goes to lost party, you're probably going to be in a world of hurt. The next thing to point out are these iconic little guards that we have here on the sides, which protect the antenna base mounts, which are plated over on this vehicle. But the M113 always has these really elaborate rails that are found on the top deck. These, again, are kit supplied. They can get confusing because there are several of them found on the runners, but if you pay attention to the instructions, these get removed, desprued, and mounted to the vehicle in a relatively quick manner. And from there, this, of course, leads us to the turret, which is the most iconic and unique aspect of this particular version of the 113 compared to its other family members. Of course, this version utilizes the turret from the Saladin armored car, and the turret itself is very nicely rendered by Tamiya. It's got all the nice shapes to it, the right angles, and the details on it that are represented are very nicely molded. One thing I do want to point out that I noticed is that on the Tamiya kit here, you actually have two turret locks that the unit needs to connect to. This ring here is, I believe, a spacer ring, if I'm not mistaken, and has a second pair of locks like you see here in order to install it. Perhaps Tamiya was working on a 1/35 scale Saladin armored car kit, and they were going to utilize this turret, but for some reason or another, it never came out. Tamiya did release a Saladin armored car, but that was an old motorized kit from 1970, and the kit's tooling I don't believe is the same as the one here on the 113. But if anyone knows this, of course, feel free to put that in the comment section listed below. The remainder of the turret, again, goes together fairly easily. There are several structure components that need to be assembled again in a systematic layout, but once you get the format down right, the whole unit just goes together without any problems. The seams that are found on the piece, there are very few. Namely, there is a center seam that is found in this section over here where the two halves join. As you can see, this was polished away with the bodywork. And I believe there was some small seam work found on this rear plate here where the rear plate plugs onto the two halves. Nothing really much to mention, but it's just something to look out for when it comes time for polishing one of these kits when you get the parts glued together. In addition to the turret being able to rotate, of course, the gun can elevate up and down. Now, this is one thing I also want to point out. When you assemble the kit, the trunnion area is a bit on the looser end, and because of that, the gun will have the tendency to flop around and doesn't want to stay in the up position. One trick that I did was the old Elmer's glue white glue trick, where you take some white glue on the tip of a wire and you put it on top of the trunnion. The glue sets, and once it does, it stiffens up the piece a little bit. It does do a pretty good job in keeping everything in place, but you don't want to over, flex the piece, because after a while the glue itself will begin to chip and wear off. But on a positive note, if it does, it's just, you can just reapply it in the same manner you did originally, giving you just, a few years of extra play, I should say. But by and large, the white glue trick is really effective at keeping these things in place. And that's true for basically all 1/35 scale tank models out there. While on the barrel, this brings me to another aspect I want to bring up, and that's the seam removal on this section. Now, unlike most plastic tank model kits where the barrel's in two halves and you glue them together and then there's that center seam to deal with, on this model here, it's done in a slightly different format, but Tamiya has used this technique on a few other builds. The barrel consists of a cylinder in this section over here, and then to cap it off, there's this little hollowed out cap that gets glued on. It works very well, but you have to keep in mind of the seam that is present on these two sections where they join. Also, with the way the peg and hole system works, if you're gluing the pieces on, you're not paying attention, you can glue it in a way where it shifts slightly from the remainder of the cylinder, and it's not impossible to fix, just it requires just a little bit more sanding. On the model here, just a little bit of thick super glue was added on the two seams, and it was just polished away with some sandpaper, leading for the result that we have here. Another bit of detailing I want to point out on the turret is with the smoke grenade launchers. These are a little bit on, I don't want to say on the trickier end, but you do have to pay attention to them. You see, they consist of a few components, namely these frames that get glued to the base itself as well as to the side of the turret, so you have some alignment to make sure it lines up. And then you have the launchers themselves, these little double barrel shotgun looking like things. These each are separate tubes that get glued onto these locations, and there's really no key and groove mechanism for that. You just basically eyeball them to the center portion here of the mount. They go on fairly easily, but it's one of those things you do want to pay attention to. Aside from the assembly, the other thing that I want to point out is with the firing cables. You see, the cable detailing is absent on this kit, but it's one that's easily added, and once added, definitely looks good. With the turret removed, you can see the firing cables that I added to this build. The wire itself was made from a thin piece of fluoro wire and was a simple addition. With a pin vise, I drilled a hole in the bottom portion here of the grenade launcher and right here on the side portion of the turret. The wire emerges out, bends around, loops up, and then just goes directly into the side of the turret. On the opposite side is a similar type of a procedure. And again, it's one of those subtle details that when you add it really does help the overall look of the build. Aside from the grenade launchers, the next bit of detailing I want to point out is the wire spool that we have here on the back. The spool of wire itself is another one of those details that are generally something that you always see and found on British pattern of vehicles, and with this turret here being directly off of a Saladin armored car would make perfect sense. As for what it is, well, my viewers were kind enough to tell me about this in one of my other videos. It is called the Don 10 system. It is a wired communication device system that connects the tank to a trench, or I believe even to other tanks when they are not in use. The detailing itself is present with the Tamiya kit, but it's absent the actual wiring that is included. The wiring that you see here I added myself with just some floor wire that was wrapped and spooled around the plastic piece once it was fully connected. After doing this, the unit was then mounted to the model, and as you can see, really gives the vehicle a nice bit of detailing compared to leaving it with the wire left off of the spool. Also, you can see here with the way, or between the differences between the two builds, on one model here I left the spool with the standard coloring of the vehicle, while on this one here, just to give it a little bit of standout, I left it in a different color of olive drab. Either way will work, it just depends on the look and feel you're going for with your build. From the Don 10 system, this now brings us to the antenna bases. The antenna bases found on the model are stock on this build and can leave a little room for improvement, I should say. But keep in mind the kit's tooling is from 1978. The one here in the back would be rubber on the real vehicle, and this one was just simply drilled out with a pin vise in order for me to install the floor wire which I use for my antennas. The unit here on the pedestal, I believe, might be a spring on the real vehicles. Hard to say. I'm not really as in tune as I am on US AFV on the type of vehicle antenna mass, but the way you see it is stock with the Tamiya kit. The only addition that I made was I drilled it out thoroughly again for the metal wire, but I also went ahead and added the wire that emerges from the bottom portion and then would enter into the tank. This is the same floor wire that's used, of course, for the remainder of the antennas. While on this location brings us back to the mantlet, you can see the bow M11319. The only trick I did was my usual technique where I take a very small Dremel bit on a pin vise and drill out the barrel section here on the machine gun. Just like with the exhaust stack, if it's not something that you have the tooling or the experience for, just leave it stock out of the box and it'll serve you well. From there brings us to our next bit of detailing, which are the turret hatches. Now, just like with the other hatches that are found on this model here, the hatches are fully functional, just with a little flick of the wrist. I even got the bow hatch open, and they swing open without any sort of problems. You notice that the Tamiya kit was pretty thorough with the detailing found on these sections over here. You have the headrest securing strap, and even, yes, the little locks. All these are integrally printed to the piece, and nothing needs to be added by the builder. All you gotta do is just with a small paintbrush, paint the headrest just so that they stand out from the remainder of the moldings. Final bit of detailing to point out is the turret-mounted M11319 Browning machine gun. The 1919 is supplied with the kit. It's decently rendered, I should say. The muzzle end, of course, I drilled out because they are generally molded solid on specifically these older kits. The 1919, it's an interesting choice for use on these vehicles. The British never really adopted the Browning M2. They used them during World War II, but post-World War II service, basically on the remainder of the British vehicles, they either kept a 1919, which I presume would have been chambered in 308, and then, of course, they would change that out to the GPMG from FN, but that was back in, I believe, the 1970s they started doing that. For vehicles of the era, like some versions of the Centurion, or specifically the Saladin armored car, and even, yes, the Conqueror heavy tank, the Browning 1919 was still present. And that now leads us to the paint and the markings. As you can clearly see, since I had two of these vehicles on hand, I might as well paint them and mark them differently from one another. For this build here, I wanted to emulate the box art with its overall look, which is why I went with the dark forest green type format. While on this build here, I was really influenced by a real M113 FSV that I've seen pictures of on the internet, and I believe that one's either in a military museum or might possibly even be in a private collection. Don't really know offhand. And of course, by painting the models in this different type of format, this does give a little bit more uniqueness to the collection as opposed to having everything in its monotone, which is something that you can easily fall into, specifically if you do a lot of kit builds after a while. This also gave me the opportunity to, of course, have the models representing the two options that are available in the decal sheets. So this one here is very different compared to the one on the opposite side. As for the quality of the decals, they were, well, standard Tamiya, which needless to say means they were fantastic. They went on without any problems, lacquered on even better, and as you can see, don't have any silvering or flash really to mention or to point out. And while on the topic of the quality of decals, the decals themselves, you have to keep in mind, were purchased, or I should say I purchased the kits back in 2006. God knows how long they've been sitting in the catalog's warehouse that I bought them from. But they were in a location of the shop that really wasn't the best in terms of environmental conditions. And although they were in that type of a situation, the decals did not suffer in any way, shape, or form. They went on as good as they would have straight from Tamiya themselves. So again, kudos to the quality of markings that are supplied with these Tamiya models. They never disappoint. At the end of the day, I'm really happy on how these two turned out. It's a good thing I let them sit in the stash for as long as they did, because if I would have built them all those years ago, they would not have been built into as nice of a condition that you see it here. Because this gave me the opportunity to build both these vehicles with different markings that are supplied with the kit, as well as also playing around with the different color schemes on each just to give them a little bit of separation. Being a Tamiya base starter kit, these models go together with very little effort required by the builder. It's just your classic example of a well-engineered and well-designed Tamiya plastic model kit. And that basically segues us into skill level and recommendation. With the base kit being that of a Tamiya 1/35 scale plastic model, the build itself is very easy to assemble. So easy, in fact, that yes, this model here I do recommend for a beginner, an intermediate, and an advanced skill range person. With this model here being exclusively an exterior rendition of the M113, this greatly cuts down the complexity and difficulty which would be found on some other renditions of the M113 that are on the market. To further simplify this kit, most of the larger panels that you see on this model have most of their surface detailing already present and molded in, which also cuts down, of course, on the complexity of the part count that's found on the runners. In combination to the large panels that I mentioned before, with the nature of the M113 platform, all of these panels just go and fit directly into their appropriate locations with really hardly any hand fitting being required. This ease of construction and relative simplicity that are found on the hull components are also translated into the turret. The Salin turret is exquisitely rendered on this kit, and the tooling allows you to assemble the turret in a very simplistic and mostly effortless manner. Really, the major thing to watch out for anybody who's building one of these kits, as well as the other M113 renditions, is of course to pay attention to the stride sprocket like I mentioned earlier. With the way the kit assembles, you don't want to just go forth ahead and accidentally glue the sprockets to the final drives, because that can cause some issues. If you pay attention to that, however, the build will go together in a more streamlined way than I had with myself doing these two here. Generally, with older production kits, they do require a little bit more hand fitting to put together compared to more contemporary counterparts, but for these models here, that's really just not the case. It's a testament to just how well Tamiya engineers their plastic model kits. Of course, with this base platform, you could easily add upon it such things as photo etch, possibly some resin upgrades, but there's not really a whole lot you can do to it. There are several aftermarket accessories and upgrades for M113s in general on the 1/35 scale marketplace, so you can easily take one of these kits and run with it further from the stock out of the box rendition that I have here. But really, again, this is up to the skill level, budget, and discretion of the builder. And to sprinkle some more good news onto these kits, they have been in basic non-stop production since the mid-1970s, and because of that, tracking one down is not going to be a difficult proposition at all. These models can be found just about anywhere, from eBay to other online retailers to hobby shops, model shows, you name it, you can probably track one or two of these kits down. Because of this, once these models are found, the prices are not going to be very egregious, barring of course you don't run into a shyster. The models themselves can be had anywhere between 15 to about 30 US dollars. And that basically leaves us with recommendation. Now, because of the model subject matter, this may limit somewhat its appeal, since it is mostly a niche type vehicle, of course being a Australian modern era military vehicle. But if anybody who is a fan of the M113 platform, this kit here is an absolute no-brainer. On a similar note, if anybody's a fan of modern era military vehicles and AFV, of course this kit here would fit right into that collection without any problems. Another obvious individual who would appreciate this kit here would be anyone who is, well, Australian, but also anyone who is interested in the military vehicles which are used by the Australian Army. As of note, there is another M113 FSV kit on the market from AFV Club, which is the more modernized version of this particular vehicle. It would be really cool to have both renditions in your collection, so you can have both the original format, being the Tamiya kit, and the AFV Club variant, which is the one from, I want to say, the earlier mid-2000s era. Finally, probably one of the last individuals who I'd recommend this kit to would be anybody who is a fan of modeling vehicles from the Vietnam War. The Australian military did see action during that conflict and did utilize this rendition here of the M113. If you're the type of person that has a collection of Vietnam War vehicles, such as the M113A1 Patton, the Sheridan, and many variants of the American M113, the addition of this kit here and the Centurion would fit right into that collection. In fact, if you don't have those models in your Vietnam War collection, you need to step up your game a bit. One final thing I want to point out before wrapping up this video is that although these kits have been in constant production since the 1970s, this kit today in 2020 is still just as relevant as they were when they were first released back in 1978. You see, although there have been several other editions and variants of the M113 kits that have been released over the years, many of which are just rehashes of Tamiya tooling, but by and large, if you're looking for something in this particular flavor, being the Australian FSV, in 135, this is the only kit that's available. There is one other rendition of the FSB, but that version is the more modernized take on this particular vehicle, and that one, of course, is produced by AFV Club. That kit itself is pretty cool. It's based on Italian retooling, but really that's something better left for another video at another time. But if you're looking for the original variant of the FSV with the Saladin turret, the version used during the Vietnam War, your only option in 135 is this guy that we have here from Tamiya. And with that, that wraps up this double feature model showcase video for this 1/35th scale Australian M113A1 FSV. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase video like these two guys over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of these two particular builds, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that are showcased on this channel. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Till next time, thanks for stopping by. Okay, let me put everything away. One more thing before we go. Seriously, Australia, what the hell's with the size of these cans? I mean, they're gigantic. I mean, you think everything is bigger in Texas. Holy hell, they got nothing on Australia. I mean, this is a foul mag, okay? 308, 7.62 NATO foul mag. It's as wide as a damn Foster's can. That's just insane. I really do look forward to drinking this.